Hello everyone, my name is Rosie Goldsmith and welcome to our digital book club brought to you by the Swiss Embassy in London. Now this is the final instalment of our discussion of Peter Beck's thriller called Damnation, and I'm thrilled to say we have a thriller. I'm thrilled to say we have both Peter Beck and Jamie Bulloch, his translator, with us today in our virtual studio. Now, Peter, you are where?
I'm in Switzerland, in Bern, sitting in my living room.
And Jamie Bulloch, they're surrounded by flowers, very nice. Where are you?
Hello, I'm in my sitting room also in London.
Now, my flowers are fake, but they are up there. And I'm in Wiltshire, so I'm near Devizes in Wiltshire. So here we are, we've been brought together in this really extraordinary time. And it's wonderful to see you both. And thank you very, very much for agreeing to do this. And how are you? How are you coping with being alone with yourselves? Peter, how are you?
I'm considering the circumstances. I'm doing fine. I'm used to do home office. Everyone in the family is healthy, and we have, my hair is normally only 3 millimeters long, and I put on 3 kilos of weight. Considering the people, who work, I don't know, the postman, the nurses in the hospitals, that's no problem. So I'm fine. I'm coping okay. I have problems to concentrate. I'm checking the news too often, but otherwise I'm perfectly okay.
Happy to hear it. How about you, Jamie, and your family? You're all together at home, I think, aren't you?
Yes, we are. So, I mean, Peter would understand, as a writer, you're used to working on your own at home. As a translator, it's exactly the same. But I'm not on my own at home, so it's slightly different. So I'm not working quite as many hours as I normally would.
Now, in this discussion, the three of us are going to be talking about Peter Beck's book, Damnation, which you've been following in the book club. And we're going to look at the book, we're going to look at the translation, we're going to look at this whole idea of Swiss thriller, question mark. I must say this is my first encounter with a Swiss thriller, and I've been reading quite a few Swiss books in the last decade or so. But first of all, a very, very quick introduction to who these two gentlemen are. Now, Peter Beck, with his book, Damnation, he studied psychology and economics and philosophy. He has lived in Switzerland and in the UK, hence his wonderful English, and he's travelled all over the world. And he calls himself a crime thriller junkie. So we're going to talk about that afterwards. And Jamie, are you a crime thriller junkie, or is this quite unusual for you to translate crime?
No, I love translating crime novels. I didn't start until I didn't really have what was my first crime novel? I can't really remember, but I've done quite a lot in the last few years, and I read quite a lot too. So I thoroughly enjoy doing them because it's a very different type of challenge, which we might talk about a bit later as a translator, from doing a more literary text. But it's a different challenge, but really just as fun.
Now, Jamie Bulloch, who has translated this particular book, Jamie has translated over 30 books, mostly literary fiction, from German to English. And you're also a historian, Jamie, I think, and German teacher, academic as well. Now, some of the books you may know that Jamie has translated are Timur Vermes' very famous book, Look Who's Back, and the most recent one, The Hungry and the Fat, Stefan Uli, Kingdom of Twilight, Robert Manasseh's Capital, and Elephant, another Swiss author, Martin Suter. Now, Jamie, first of all, what was it like, by comparison with the other novels, translating this book, Damnation?
The experience is different, because what you get in any sort of thriller or action book is a different type of scene, a sort of set piece scene where a lot of action happens. And the way I find it's easiest to translate a section like that is not so much to get too hung up on the individual words and sentences, but to try and replay the scene filmically in your mind to work out what's going on, then find the best way to describe it. And if that means slightly rejigging the sentences or slightly rejigging the words, then so be it, because it gives a better sense of tension and sort of drama to the scene. And this is something you wouldn't necessarily do, for example, with a more literary text.
It is, I know people have said this before, Peter, about this book. It is a Swiss James Bond like thriller, and it really is. Were you channeling James Bond when you wrote it?
I never thought about writing a James Bond. When I did the book, it wasn't in my mind. Maybe I was channeling it subconsciously. The label Swiss James Bond stuck when the first journalist mentioned it. And there are elements that the action scenes, I don't know, the global setting, the different scenes in Egypt, Norway, America, in the Swiss mountains, that are James Bond elements. But while I was writing it, I never thought about it. But me being me, I obviously saw all the James Bonds, so maybe it came subconsciously into the book. So
there are obviously a lot of influences have fed into this as well. And I did say right at the beginning that you're a crime novel thriller junkie. So who else are you channeling in this to create your own very distinctive style, really? But there are lots of influences I can see.
I probably read all the famous names. Lee Child. At the moment I'm reading James Lee Burke, and I can just dive into it, and that I try to learn from all the big masters and try to develop my own style.
Tell us about Tom Winter, and give us a very short synopsis of the novel, just in case people haven't been following it so far. Just very briefly, and then we'll talk a little bit more.
Okay, Tom Winter, he's the hero. He's head of security of a Swiss private bank. And in that role, he's, kind of unique. I try to do something which is different from the inspector or the detective you usually get. And it starts off with a helicopter crash. And in the helicopter crash, he's number two. It's a woman, he's a bit in love with her. And a very rich client, an Arab, die in the Swiss mountains. And then the question is, who did it? And from there on, he follows the trail of the money and encounters all kinds of baddies. And I don't want to give away the whole story, but it goes all over the world with some action scenes. So best thing, you read the book.
It's got, it's great fun to read, but it's also a really good page-turning narrative. And how important was it for you that there was a really strong plot? Because you've got characters, you've got great location, Switzerland, Norway, Egypt, the United States. I'm trying to think, where have I missed? Anyway, a lot of different global locations. And then you've got this great character, and you've got some really good female characters in there too. Congratulations on that as well. But this plot, the idea of having a really strong plot, was that important to you?
Character, plot, sceneries, dialogue, humor are all elements which are important for me. And I picked a topic. I wrote the book, I don't know, 2013, 14, and the topic is infrastructure and who owns it, which is, if you look at nowadays challenges, who owns the pharmaceutical companies who will eventually produce the vaccine against corona. All the medicine is produced in China, and the topic in Damnation is who owns the critical energy infrastructure. Is it the Arabs? Is it the Americans? And how vulnerable is society if something goes wrong with this kind of infrastructure?
If you talk about those issues, and the issues do come through this novel very strongly, it's obviously very important to you to make this more than just a thriller, a page-turning thriller. You want to address certain topics, and obviously banking and the whole, the ethics of banking and investment and global markets and so on. It's all in there. Do you think? Are you quite critical of the way Switzerland and the global markets work?
I try to, personally, I'm quite critical because, I know quite a bit. I do in my other life, I work as a consultant in big businesses doing cultural development. So I have some insights behind the scene. And therefore, I'm quite critical. In the book, I try to take the different perspectives. Winter has a boss, he just wants to make money. So he has clients which are, flexible with their moral. So I try to look through their eyes on a global topic.
You've got this character, Tom Winter. I'm always inclined to say Tom Winter in German. Now let's talk about him as well, because he's intriguing in that he is not just a violent, he's suave, he's sophisticated, all those things, but he also is slightly insecure psychologically. He questions himself. He actually treats women well. Did you find that too, Jamie, that Tom Winter is himself a really interesting character? I really ended up liking him much more than I like James Bond, actually. So there you are.
Yes, he's a bit of a, he's a bit of a loner. He has this sort of house that he's been building in the mountains, and he obviously is sort of comfortable in his own company. Although he's also quite gregarious and sociable, but he likes the outside life. He likes skiing, like pretty much every Swiss person. No, I just found him quite an engaging character, and especially because it's not, as Peter was saying, he didn't choose a detective, he didn't choose a spy, he didn't choose a police officer or a soldier. But in fact, you've got a head of security for a bank, which is quite an interesting, it's quite an interesting alternative.
Now, Peter, you started off writing this series of books, as you said, about 2013. It was published in German. Jamie then brought it out and translated. It was published in the UK in 2018. Have you already got all 3 books lined up? Have they all been written?
In German, 3 books are out. The last one came out last spring. It's actually about the virus as well, so I was ahead of time. It's transmitted in the water, not through the air. That's book number 3. So now I'm just waiting that it goes ahead with the translation and the English version, but that always takes time and a certain degree of luck.
So you had, from the very outset, you had this idea of making Tom Winter a protagonist, and the setting is always the same. He's in Switzerland, because we haven't got the novels yet in English. Are they being translated, Jamie?
Not yet, unfortunately, but we hope. So they're both very exciting and very engaging. And the second one, I don't remember a huge amount about it, but it is a family story. It's a kind of family saga with various members of this family all sort of grabbing for money from an inheritance, and you have to kind of work out who was the one who committed the crime. Family stories are universal. They work in any culture, and with different personalities, but all coming from the same family. It's a really, really interesting book.
So this idea, Peter, of having 3 novels featuring the same character, and building up his character, I imagine, as well, all the way through. Is that it? After 3, is that the end of Tom Winter? Does he die at the end? You're obviously not going to tell us, but what happens after these 3?
I don't know yet. I'm thinking about other projects too.
That's interesting, because you bring in your background, your interest in psychology and obviously business and finance and travel into your books. And I wanted to ask you about this idea of Switzerland. People have all these ideas about Switzerland, all these stereotypes. Everybody knows what they are. But you have created something with this novel. At the moment, we only have the one, Damnation, to read in English, which is about Switzerland and the rest of the world. Now, very often the Swiss books I read are not about the rest of the world. They're very Swiss focused. And obviously Switzerland is a beautiful and wonderful country to focus on. But I wondered about your intention. Was it your very deliberate intention to make this book look out beyond Switzerland?
Yeah, very much. I set out to write an international thriller, and the international bit for me is important. I love traveling, So I can, when I travel, I always look out for cool locations. So I can combine work and travel together. And so all the settings I try to visit, I always take pictures, and then I will build them into the next book.
So this idea of, you know, Swiss literature looking outside a little bit more than perhaps we're used to. I mean, is that a fair enough assessment, Jamie, of Swiss literature?
I have to say my experience would be slightly different from yours in the books I've read. Another author who I've translated, and you mentioned earlier on, Rosie, is Martin Zuter. And Elephant, for example, takes the protagonist all the way to Sri Lanka, and a lot of it's set there. Another of his books, I can't remember the name now, but that ends up, there's a lot of it set in Thailand. And then I think of a classic Swiss novel I read again actually last year, Max Frisch's Homo Faber. That's also set in South America. I think one of the reasons why a lot of Swiss, well, and I'm talking about mainly now Swiss German writers, I don't know enough about Swiss French or Swiss Italian writers, have such an internationalist outlook is because their domestic market is quite small relative to, let's say, the German language market as a whole in Germany, Austria, and other parts of the world. So they've got to somehow write a little bit outside of their own sort of more narrow experience to appeal to a much wider audience. Because if you want to appeal to the German audience as a whole, you're looking at 95 million or 100 million people.
But it is interesting, this juxtaposition of the village-based literature you get in Switzerland, I think, and this sort of, you know, going outside, going beyond, because it is such a small country. I'm just trying to think of, you know, people like Lucas Baufuss and, you know, others who, you know, like you, Peter, as well, who travel very, you know, and crossing borders, speak several languages. You are actually global citizens, actually living, nevertheless, in a very small country. Is that for you is it in any way a difficulty? Are there two souls in your breast? You know, a local and a global.
First I'm Bernese, then I'm Swiss, and then I'm European, and then I'm global. So the closer it is, the closer it is to my heart. But I would definitely define myself as European. You know, all that nationalistic talk going on all over the world, that's just not going to help in the future. So personally, I'm it's a huge privilege that we can travel, we can afford to travel, or I hope we will be able to travel in the near future again. That's a huge privilege, and for me it was always clear that I wanted to have that also in my books.
Can you explain this paradox, though, for me, of Swiss crime writing? I mean, why is there so little Swiss crime writing? Why is Swiss noir not even a phrase that anybody would ever think of using for Swiss writing?
We haven't figured it out. I have, I meet up with other Swiss authors, crime fiction writers, and we haven't figured it out why it is. And there are several answers to that question. One, Jamie already mentioned, we're Swiss Germans. We're a minority in the Dachraum, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. Another one is you have Dachnoir and Scandinoir, and their market is even, especially the Scandinoir, is even smaller. There are, I don't know, 5 million Swedes, 5 million Norwegians. So the government in Norway basically immediately translates or supports the translation into English. So if you're Norwegian or Icelandic or whatever, you immediately get onto the English-speaking stage. I don't agree that we don't have crime writers. We have Dürrenmatt, we have Glauser, we have monuments in Swiss crime writing in the past. At the moment, I think there are several other guys emerging who write great crime fiction, who don't have to hide behind the English crime fiction writer. It's just a question how much exposure you get. and that's will grow over time, because I'm 100% convinced that we have the quality.
And you have the crime. I mean, that's the other other paradox, which is, you know, people always, and this comes out very clearly in your book as well. You have, you know, the beautiful mountains and some wonderful descriptions of Switzerland in your novel, but nevertheless there is evil lurking beneath. And so it's not as if you don't have the crime. It's really interesting, isn't it, Jamie, that it's actually not, but one of the things I think maybe is that Switzerland doesn't promote itself in that way. I do think it's not just, maybe you think otherwise, it's actually quite a modest country in that sense. You're quite quiet people. What do you think, Jamie?
It's a very difficult market to break into, I think. That's the other problem. Peter and I met at Crime Fest in Bristol a couple of years ago, where it's more like a convention actually than a literary festival. And just seeing the range and wealth of crime writers from around the world, but even just from the English-speaking world, it just makes you see how hard it is to break into what is a very crowded market. And I suppose there's always the temptation, isn't there, Peter, if you're a foreign writer, a Swiss writer, it doesn't matter where you're from actually, but do you then copy the Anglo-Saxon models that are successful in crime writing, or do you try and take your own path completely and attempt something else, but then something else which might not find much resonance in an international market? It's very difficult to know, I think, how to pitch yourself.
I don't know. I think it's a winner takes all market. You know, you have the top 10 you find at the airports, and they're just there because they're famous. And afterwards, it's very, very difficult to get, you know, into papers, into the news, into the head of the people that they recognize you. There's limited shelf space in all the bookshops.
I'm looking forward, I must say, very much to seeing more Swiss crime writing, because you have such a great literary tradition as well. I mean, you mentioned Dürrenmatt and Frisch and so on too. But funnily enough, you wouldn't necessarily think of them as crime writers. They did so much else as well, as do you all. I mean, this is your first novel, Damnation. It's done very well in the German-speaking world. I wonder whether there is something that you think you can do as a Swiss writer to really, you know, if in your dreams, what would you do to break out and make it, you know, to the top of the bestseller list in the UK or in the United States? What would be the magic solution to that, do you think?
You know, I came to the conclusion that you just need a certain degree of luck. I can do my best, try to work very, very hard to get a good text out. And then you need a good publisher, point blank, the imprint of One World. They did a great job in making the book happen. But afterwards, there are, I don't know, 10,000, 20,000 new crime fiction books a year. And there you just need the luck that someone who's in a very influential position mention you, and then you get into, I don't know, New York Times or whatever. And if you get a decent review there, it might take off or not. You
are very lucky. We all know anybody is very lucky if they're translated by Jamie Bulloch from German, being one of the top German translators in the UK. Now, Jamie, as far as translating this book goes, I mean, there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of short sentences, a lot of financial, banking, trading vocabulary as well. I wondered, do you, when you translate a book like this, do you find yourself having to, you know, look in, you know, read the Financial Times from cover to cover to get into the language? I mean, how did you go about translating Damnation?
It's an interesting point you make, because I think every translator will have this experience to some extent, in that with any book you work on, there's a certain amount of research that has to be done, often at a fairly shallow level, but you're going to come across things that the author may know in far greater depth, subjects that the author may know in far greater depth than you. And particularly with something like Damnation. Now, I am financially illiterate. It's not too complicated. There's no point in any crime writer making it overly complicated because the audience won't follow and the reader doesn't want to have to work too hard at that. But nonetheless, there are certain times where you think, I can just about wing this. And there are other times when you have to either get in touch with the author and say, what do you really mean by this? Or you ask somebody who does know more. But that I think, I mean, it's good you reminded me of that, because I think for me that was the trickiest part of the book, actually, was just making sure that I wasn't making any kind of howler with regard to the financial improprieties that occur.
In real life, he speaks a Swiss-German dialect. Now, you wrote in German. I'm sure hopefully people are following this, and then Jamie translated it from German into English. Now, Jamie, do you notice the difference when you're translating from a Swiss German?
I tend to think I mean, I have a slight sort of pet theory about this, that the Swiss German writers, and particularly Swiss German writers rather than Swiss French writers, they're almost writing in a foreign language. I mean, not a completely foreign language, but it's not the language they speak. And I think they tend to, the Swiss writers I've come across and the ones I've worked with, they tend to write a very sort of pure German, a very readable, sort of lucid German, I've always found, apart from when you get the odd bit of dialect as part of dialogue. But generally speaking, I find them quite easy to read and nice to work with. Yeah, I find they write a very good literary German in that respect.
Does that sound like a good analysis of your language, Peter?
It's German. I write in a generic German. So you don't get a strong dialect aspect in it. It's like, I don't know, Oxford English, where everyone understands it. You know, it's not Scottish or a strong dialect. So that should make it easy for Jamie to translate it. And I also have a rule. I try not to use words which are not understood by people who haven't had the privilege to go to high school or so. I say, you know, you should have a vocabulary of 2,000 words, and with that I should make do to write the thriller. If you take something out of, I don't know, which is ranked 5,000th in the dictionary, the words are already getting too complicated. So I try to work with the vocabulary of 2,000 words and not more. I don't know if I achieved it, but you can read it at the beach and you don't have to Google words and stuff.
Is it very consciously written as an accessible, popular?
Very much, yeah. It's my goal. I love reading at the beach, in the tub, to, I don't know, relax in the evening or on the holidays. I don't think that it should be hard work. You know, there are those guys who write sentences which are half a page long, chapters where you don't know when it will end. You know, if you just want to immerse yourself in another world, escapism, I think is the word, that they have easy access. You can read it when you're commuting, half an hour in the train, you can read 2 or 3 chapters.
When you started writing this, did you have a checklist of what you wanted in this novel? Because it occurred to me, I mean, as you would, you know, make a James Bond film, for example, that you would have great locations, you have, you know, great character, Tom Winter, you'd have great action sequences, you'd have the struggle between good and evil. Did you have a similar checklist? Were you thinking about that as you were writing it?
Yeah, I think so. I had what you mentioned, location, character, story, action scenes. You haven't mentioned the sex scenes, you know, I mentioned it in the first video on the CONNEC book club. In the German version, the scenes are much more explicit. And then One World deleted those scenes. Now Tom Winter goes into the bedroom and comes out of the bedroom, and the bits in between disappeared in the editing process due to, I don't know, Puritanism in the States was the reasoning of the editor.
No sex, please. We're British. You know, we're sensitive souls, Jamie, in that. You know, and also Jamie's got to translate it. You've got to think of his sensitivities. You know, not too much sex. He's a family man. But anyway, joking aside, I mean, it does have all the aspects of a really good thriller, and it sounds as though you just enjoyed writing it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's. I say writing is hard work. It's 99% hard work and 1% perspiration. And there are, and I'm not joking, there's about 10, 12 versions of the book. So I go on and write, and then I delete and write again, delete, kill scenes, kill characters. And I try to distill it like whiskey, you know, it matures over time. With each version, it gets more succinct, more punchier. I try to get rid of everything, I call it waste, you know. If it doesn't have to be there, get rid of it.
As far as the translation goes, is it 99% hard work, 1% inspiration? How does that balance work for you as the translator?
I think it very much depends on the book, actually. I think my job sounds a bit more fun than Peter's, I would say. I think you know, there are some books that just absolutely zip along when you're translating them, partly because you have that joy of sort of writing, but you're writing someone else's ideas and you're just putting it into language. And sometimes it just absolutely flows very quickly. You know, you're sort of typing as quickly as you can think. And then other times you just get stuck by not even a sentence, but sometimes a word. I can sit there for 20 minutes, 25 minutes, just chewing over one particular word. I wanted to come back, though, to an interesting point, what Peter was saying about the editing process of a book. And it's quite interesting that translating a book, or, you know, rendering it into a different language, that's another big, important stage in an editing process that maybe readers don't really think about very much. But when a book gets translated, not only have you got the translator looking at the text more forensically than even, let's say, a German editor, a Swiss editor would have looked at it, but then you've got the UK editor as well having a look at it, UK proofreader. So it goes through another major process of editing, which may then also involve suggestions for further cuts. You know, so sometimes the process of translation can flag up things that originally passed through in a novel, which maybe an editor sort of missed out on first time round.
And if we think of the translated book, if we think of Damnation as not just Peter Beck's book, but as Jamie Bulloch's book, it's also a book that belongs to the editor, it belongs to the agent, it belongs to the publisher. It's such an extraordinary process, and people really don't see all those different elements.
No, absolutely not.
And they probably should.
Teamwork. It's teamwork. At the end of the day, I'm producing the first draft and the second draft, third draft, but afterwards I give the baby away. I actually think when I read the book again in English, and I was in Japan, I got your first translation, and I actually thought it reads better in English than in German. And that is Jamie did a great job translating it, because I read a lot in English myself. So in German, I see all the, I don't know, the mistakes, the things which I don't 100% like, and I don't see that in English. So I'm sure Jamie did, you know, you improved along the way when you say, oh, that's too complicated, you can leave that half, make 2 sentences out of one. And I think that makes the book another filter in terms of quality. So first is me, and then the German editor, and then you, and then the English editor. So the English reader actually has a better book than the German reader has from that point of view.
Well, I think that's wonderful. Congratulations to both of you in that case. And we need to wrap up very quickly, very soon. But I just want to ask you one last question. We are living, it's not even a cliche, we are living in extraordinary times. These are very difficult times. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and here we are alone in our rooms. Okay, we've got family around us. We're very lucky that we've got people living with us, but a lot of people are alone. I'm wondering how you feel that literature will change, how your lives will change as writers and translators as a result of what's happening now. Do you think it's too soon to say? Because if you think of this novel, Peter, this is a global financial trading travel book. It's, you know, James Bond packed. It takes place in so many different locations. There are many different characters. It's a different world. Are you going to be writing a different novel after COVID-19?
I don't know how we come out of it. I'm hopeful. I'm an optimist. I'm hopeful that we get back to normal again. You know, at the moment we did was masks or whatever, and it's difficult to imagine wearing a mask all the time in Switzerland. So it's too early to say. I had a weird experience, you know. My mother was lived through the war, the Second World War, and she's quite old. And when she watched the news and they showed black and white film from the war and linked it with the pandemic, she got really scared because it stirred something deep inside her, which made her remember her childhood. She was, I don't know, 12 years old during the World War II. And it stirred something in her, which I haven't seen in her since it's the first time in her life that I saw that. So for me, that is something we talked about, Scandi Noir, Swiss Noir. So I try, when I have the capacity, headspace to write again, it will be my ambition to put that noir element in my writing, because I think that comes deep out of the soul of the people, out of the innermost. And because we're all scared because we don't know what's going to happen. So that's my ambition. But at the moment, I don't feel, I don't have the headspace to do it, but that's what I'm going to try to do when I have the capacity again.
Jamie, what about you? I mean, as a translator, you're used to working on your own at home. How do you see your life changing?
I suppose, sort of slightly echoing Peter's thoughts, we're still in the middle of this, and the outcome is so uncertain, or what's going to happen over the next few months is so uncertain, it's really quite hard to say. I have another 2 books I'm working on at the moment, which will take me up to, well, I can take my time over these because there's not a massive hurry, but after that, I just don't know. And I suppose, you know, my livelihood very much depends on to what extent the publishing industry is still intact to the same extent at the end of this, you know. But my life of working from home and pottering around in the garden and such like isn't changing massively, you know. And the fact we're in this, you know, this bizarre situation at a time where we've had the most gorgeous weather also for the last 10 days, it's also quite sort of unreal.
As you can see, the sun is shining through my window at the moment. It's very, very warm.
Yeah.
I think to end on a positive note, I just want to thank you both, obviously, very much indeed, but also to say this is a wonderful time for reading. It is a great time for the book, because we do have more time to sit and read and to translate and write. It's probably a lot of my writer friends are saying it's actually quite difficult to write at the moment, because it is, you know, there's so many different things happening. But nevertheless, it is, I think we'll look back and we'll think, what a great time this was for literature, for books, for reading, for reconnecting with that wonderful experience of reading. And I hope it's not going to be negative. I hope the publishing industry will pick up. I hope there'll always be work for translators and always hear from great Swiss writers too. But Peter Beck in Bern, thank you very, very much for joining us today. And thank you for this wonderful book as well, for Damnation. We'll continue to talk about it and read it, I'm sure, and hope that the other two are translated and published as well in English. And to Jamie Bulloch, as always, wonderful translation, wonderful book, and it's always great to talk to you, Jamie. I hope that we can reconnect in real life at some point, but for the moment, thank you everyone for joining us virtually in the Swiss Digital Book Club. See you again soon. Thank you.